Hello again, Dan Albanese. One of the course objectives is grader, and in thinking about that, this is just an opinion. The grader itself is probably on its way out. Very few construction companies even have one, let alone use them. If you remember back in the introduction, we talked about how they used to use a road grader to keep the unimproved roads, the stone roads, graded out late 1800s, early 1900s. And the reason being is if you had a grader, its points of contact with the ground were over a larger area, so it was not affected by minor variations of pitch and grade, and therefore you can keep your blade pretty square and level with the ground and make a nice fine grade over long distances. Nowadays they have GPS laser systems. You can accomplish the same thing with a dozer or a loader. Very little skill is needed in keeping a grade these days as opposed to when I first started, but the paper says grader, so we'll look at a grader. A little side note, the educators might have that as their objectives. It might need to be updated. Probably something more along the lines of a track hoe, like that one back there, should be in place of a grader, but we'll talk about a grader. I did operate a grader. Again, it was probably late 80s, early 90s when they were a little more popular than now. It had a 371 Detroit in it, and grader operation is actually one of the more complicated ones because of everything that's going on all at the same time. I came out to an old grader graveyard, I guess you can call it, and we're going to look at a very old one simply because the controls are easily visible on film. We're not going to start it, we're not going to use it, but you should get an idea of the knowledge of how to use it and what all the controls are. So we'll look at this one. There you have it. Yes, that is an old one. This one's actually got a 353 Detroit from the looks of it. Tandem. Every once in a while you'll find single drive systems. The reason I chose this one was obviously with no cab. Everything is exposed out in the open. You can point to and see how they work pretty well. So this one here, we said it has tandem drive, which is one drive coming out of the center, and then inside this area here is a chain, a very large chain, which drives the two wheels. So you have engine, transmission coming into a gear set, and then a chain operation going to the two wheels. I'm going to try and be brief. There's a lot that goes on with a grader, so I'm just going to rush right on through it. First and foremost obvious is steering. You do have a steering wheel with grease points, and all that did is it went into a very standard steering box. This one was actually power steering, hard to believe at this age, and regular steering similar to a car with tie rod ends and pivot points. What would be different, and we'll come back to this, is this cylinder right here. If you notice, it's connected to what would be the kingpins. There's a separate pivot point in there. Now, granted, these things were not made for high speeds, so you didn't have to worry about balance too much and toe in, toe out, and being exactly perfect. This area in here, this is called your scarifiers. You can see the slots where the scarifier teeth would come through. This one's missing the teeth. if you were working with very hard stony ground, you would run your scarifier through to break up the ground. So you can see here's where you have your pivot point, and this would pivot down and push the scarifiers down into the ground to here's your hydraulic cylinder for scarifiers. It's on the other side right there. It will push down, dig up the dirt, dig up the stones, break up stones, especially slate and shale. Works very well. Now the main part of the grader obviously is the blade. And the blade, you can imagine a straight blade on a round pivoting table with gears. This one here again was hydraulically controlled. You have this hydraulic motor right here. Would turn a worm gear inside, which would pivot on that tooth section over there, and that would angle the blade one way or the other. You could adjust the degree of cut by that. These two cylinders right here, as you can see, they're on ball joints. What they do is they actually push the blade down into the ground, and you can adjust, do you want it to cut more on the right side, the left side, what kind of grade were you trying to get. That was all done manual adjustment through these two cylinders over here. This particular piece has another cylinder. There you can see it down there on the end. This actually extends the blade out. You can see it through here. There's actually 3 sections of blade on these. This one here, it would have this one slide out, that one slide out, so you can make it wider or narrower, depending on how much of your machine you could utilize. So you had so much horsepower, but it was really the weight of the machine that was able to determine how wide you can grade, and the soil that you're in. Is it rocky or was it sandy? The more sandy, loose soil, the wider area you can do, the deeper cuts you can do. You wouldn't need the scarifier, which would add to horsepower demands. Obviously you have your seat. I don't want to be sitting in that one anymore. And your controls over here, look at that, still has the key in it. How about that? You have brake and clutch and gear shift. The original ones were manual, then they went into flow trans. And these are all your controls. Every one of them went to a different spool valve. As you can see, all the lines come out, and you would use these controls for each one of the cylinders and each one of the purposes, whether it's scarifier, whether it was the blade, the pitch of the blade. Everything was controlled by these controls over here. One of those controls again being these cylinders, which would adjust the angle in which the front tires were coming in contact with the ground. Whenever you plow, or blade in this case, if you have your blade angled to the right, meaning the left side is more forward than the right side, the material is going to push the machine. So it's a battle between the weight of the machine versus the weight of what you're trying to push. So what you would do to counter that is, if it's trying to push the machine to the left, you would take these front tires and you would angle them so that they would dig in the ground more. Instead of skidding flat surface, they would be digging in, and it would help hold your machine straight. So this is a very basic machine, again very old. The ones that I operated were actually more along the lines of these. You see 2 Caterpillars sitting over there with cabs. We used them mainly to maintain roadways in and out in industrial areas. Again, these are a little bit larger. They're both tandems. But the same principles apply. You can see the scarifier diggers, you can see the blade controls. Everything is essentially the same on all of them, with the exception that these cabs actually had heat, which was a very nice addition. That's the grader.